We're recording, so that's now being done.
We're recording. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, an introduction to RO-Crate. So RO-Crate is an open, community-driven, lightweight approach to packaging research objects with their metadata. Basically, the core idea is that when we do research, I'm just moving my Zoom controls, sorry. When we do research, we produce a bunch of stuff that includes publications, data, workflows, presentations, all sorts of things. And with RO-Crate, what we want you to do is sort of collect all those items together and connect them together with metadata. So you say this publication is about this data, and we use this workflow to create it, and so on and so forth. And so it all gets packaged into this sort of conceptual crate or box. And that process of doing that makes your data more discoverable, and especially when you're describing processes like computational workflows, it can make them more reproducible and more executable. Put another way, RO-Crate is all about capturing the who, what, where, and how of your research and how your outputs came to be. So it's all about provenance. Now, when we talk about RO-Crate in conversations, we may well have had conversations where we've mentioned RO-Crate with you before. We kind of use the word RO-Crate with a bunch of different meanings. So I want to just spell out what those are, since this is supposed to be an attempt to demystify the concept. First of all, there's the overarching RO-Crate project and community. So when I say RO-Crate is an approach to packaging research objects with their metadata, I'm talking about the whole project. Then there's specifically the RO-Crate specification. So I might say in RO-Crate, we describe people in such and such a way. That's a reference to what the specification says on that subject. An RO-Crate can also be a specific digital object that contains some data files and an RO-Crate metadata file, which I'll explain in a second. So you'll say, we made an RO-Crate containing our results. It's a specific digital object. And RO-Crate might also refer to metadata that's been written in line with the RO-Crate specification. So if I say we captured information about workflow execution in the RO-Crate, what I mean is that's described in metadata following the RO-Crate format. So I'm going to expand a bit more on each of these. I've already kind of explained the point of RO-Crate, the project. It's all about capturing provenance and enabling reproducible research. The RO-Crate specification, we're not going to get into in this meeting, but it tells you how to construct an RO-Crate. It tells you what you must include, things you should include, and things you may include in the metadata. And the core idea is about producing, or it is about making sure there's a minimum amount of useful metadata provided with your research outputs. And then you can add extra stuff if you like. But there's a core set of stuff that you must have that everyone who is reading RO-Crates will know to expect to be there. In TREvolution, we'll be using version 1.2 of RO-Crate, which is not absolutely finalized, but we are voting to release it tonight. So hopefully it will be finalized very, very soon. That third usage of RO-Crate as a digital object, there are two approaches to doing this. In the first case, we might have a folder with some data that we want to publish. And what we do is we add an RO-Crate metadata.json file, or a file called RO-Crate metadata.json to this folder. We put all our metadata in there. You don't need to make any other changes to your file structure or the files themselves. And you just distribute this whole folder together. That's it. Adding this metadata file turns this folder into an RO-Crate. However, there might be cases where we have a folder with data that we don't want to publish. And this is especially the case when it comes to sensitive data. In that case, we can create the same kind of metadata file, but put it somewhere else and create references to our data. And that could be through a link that goes through some sort of authentication before you access the data. It might be a sort of placeholder that describes what's in the data, but doesn't actually provide you with the data itself. There are a few different options. And basically you'll populate this metadata file and you will distribute that file by itself. And because these are both very simple examples, you can actually combine them. You can distribute a folder that has some data in it, but also references some data that's stored elsewhere, and so on. And this is all, again, covered by the RO-crate specification. And finally, there's the metadata itself. And so the actual metadata is written in a format called JSON-LD, which is JSON for linked data. We're not going to show you that because who wants to look at JSON? But here's a sort of graphical representation of what the metadata is like. So it's this sort of connected web of stuff. In the center, you have your overarching description of your whole data set. So, the name of your study or the authors that created the whole thing, and so on. And this will link out to specific data files that, again, they might be included in the crate directly, or they might be included as references to things that are hosted outside the crate, or things which are digital representations of a real thing, like a person. So in this case, we have a data set that has some parts, files, collections of files, and so on. It also references some sensitive data. And you can also reference things like processes. So we might want to describe like a disclosure process that's happened. And your data set will mention that process, and your description of that process will say what that process was targeting, or the object of that process, which might be the whole data set, or it might be some specific files. This is just sort of the simplest example of what that might look like. And then, you include all this extra bits like authors and their affiliations and so on. And these are all done as far as possible with persistent identifiers. So for your data set, when you publish it, it'll be given a DOI, hopefully, or similar. Authors have ORCIDs and so on. And all this sort of lives inside this dotted box, which I've written as inside the RO-crate, by which I specifically mean it's contained within the RO-crate metadata. And you'll see these arrows which don't have labels. These actually come from things that are outside the RO-crate or elsewhere online. So you might have a paper that's been published that is about this data, and it will reference this data set as like an external reference. You might have a workflow that uses this data set as an input. And then those things might get referenced by other things. Your authors, because they're using ORCID, will be connected to other papers, data, and software, and so on. And so you build up this sort of complex web of interconnected references, and everything is linked together. And when you've got that kind of linked data sets across the whole web, you can run interesting queries and study these connections. So the benefits of RO-crate and some of the reasons we're using RO-crate in TREvolution. Firstly, that it's easy to consume and use because of this standardized interoperable format. It's already got a large cross-domain global community, which has built a lot of tools that we can make use of, some of which I help to maintain and some of which I don't. And it also respects data sensitivity. So you can make your data more fair without needing to share it publicly. You can describe your data without releasing your data. And it does all this through the power of linked data. This is web technology that's also used in a bunch of other places. And so it's naturally interconnected with other RO-crates and with the wider web. I mentioned that we have a bunch of tools. I've put links to the ones that I've mentioned in the Google document as well. So we have some browser-based tools which allow you to build crates using a sort of graphical user interface. There are libraries for Python, JavaScript, and a bunch more languages. We have validation tools that can verify that the metadata that you've got follows the RO-crate specification. And we've been exploring options for visualizing RO crates as well, which is a bit of a work in progress. And I mentioned that we have a very active community. So it's an open community on GitHub. Anyone can join. We have some tutorials, which you can use to kind of get started. I run drop-in sessions twice a month where anyone can come along and just chat to me about RO Crate and how they want to apply it in any particular context. And we're also using RO Crate in a couple of other TRE-focused projects like HDR UK and in Trust, which is a European project around trusted research environments. Okay, I think I saw some comments go into the chat, but I haven't read them yet. So let's have a pause for questions before we talk about profiles and 5-safes RO Crate. Warren, could you just read me off what questions there are?
At the moment, don't see any questions just yet, apart from one on Zoom and whether or not it lets you see the slides by default, which I swear was default usually, but apparently you have to click the button at the top. So make sure just to remind everyone as well, the tutorials and things that are referenced in the slides are in the Google Doc that was shared with the meeting invite. So if you do want to go through any of the tutorials or access any of the materials or tools, then yeah, the ones that are referenced are in there. And of course, drop any of us a line if you do, if you need any help with those. But yeah, if there are any questions, I'll let you.
I can see that there is one in the Google Doc actually that says any data integrity procedures. Do you want to, if whoever put that in, do you want to expand on that question? Do you mean integrity of the data that you're describing or or the metadata itself?
Yeah, well, the whole thing, I was just wondering if there's a procedure built into it for, like, I don't know, hashing it. Is there a standard procedure for anything for that? I mean, I'm probably jumping about 3 or 4 guns here, so I'll probably let it lie and then maybe come back to it if it appears later. But yeah, I mean, I was wondering about the integrity of the whole JSON thing. So it's all right if you're getting it from a standard source, but it would be good eventually if there was something built in so that it could be linked to people's keys and things, so that you knew what you were getting was what you were supposed to be getting. But I think like I say, I'm jumping several guns there, I think.
Yeah. So I think when you're describing like the actual data in an RO crate, you can include that kind of information like a hash. So you can validate the integrity of the data. As for the integrity of the metadata itself, I don't know, Stian, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically jumping into the next section here, yeah, because there are 2 aspects to what you're asking for in terms of integrity. So one aspect is because as you saw how Eli said, there could be many different objects in our crate, and what you're going to hear about next on our crate profile is how you can say, well, for my kind of crates, they always have A, B, and C, right? And that's something that you can define in a profile and that you can then get a validator to check if that is the case in terms of the declaration that there are certain type of objects and statements about those present. That, of course, is not mean integrity in terms of it being tampered with and these kind of things. So that's a different level of integrity, which 5-safes are a crate use. A method called Bagit, which is like a wrapper around the crate that adds file checksums using, it's flexible in terms of checksums, but I think it requires at least SHA-256 if I remember. This is a separate checksums that are on the outside. Of course, this only applies to files you have kind of physically there in the folder. I cannot check some things on the internet. For that, you have to do like Eli said. And then there are some people who do cryptographic things as well, and I don't want to delve into that as that can get a bit scary, but that's also a level of integrity you can do.
Thank you.
Just thought I'd mention, we do briefly touch on the move towards validating that 5-safes profile as well. So we'll briefly mention that at the end, but there is a validator under construction using things like Shackle to do constraint validation. But generally, each profile has a must-have, should have, and may have collection of things. So yeah, just a quick comment on that.
Cool. Seeing no further questions, I will move on to RO crate profiles. So RO crate profiles basically extend the RO crate specification to define conventions for a specific domain or a specific type of data. So RO crate, like the base specification, is very general and it's completely domain agnostic. You can apply it to all sorts of things, and people are applying it to all sorts of things. But invariably, when you start applying it in a particular domain, there are extra bits of metadata that are really important in that specific domain that you want to, as a community, kind of agree to include in your crates. So that's what profiles are trying to accomplish. Again, profiles can describe things you must include, things you should include, and things you may include in addition to the basic requirements of RO crate. They can add additional terms or vocabularies to the metadata. So RO crate comes with like a set of terms by default that are just sort of common metadata terms that come from schema.org. But if you have a specific vocabulary you want to use, like or ontology, like OMOP or something, you can have a profile that says to include those things. And you can also impose a specific file structure within the crate. That might not be something that we do for TREvolution, but it's something that a couple of profiles have done. They've said, we want you to structure your data in such and such a way so that it's usable by various tools that use that profile. And again, the aim of a profile is not to capture absolutely everything that anyone might want to include about this type of data, but it's to standardize or settle on a minimum useful metadata for the target domain. So it can describe how to include some extra things as well, but the aim is for that minimum set of metadata to be agreed on. To give a couple of examples, so here's a diagram where at the top we have the RO crate base specification, and then you have profiles that basically inherit this. So they'll have all the requirements of the base specification and some more on top. So we have, for example, a profile called process run crate, which is all about capturing information about some computational process that has occurred. And that might be you ran a program on the command line. It might be that you ran something in a container. It can capture information like the execution time or the start and end time, environmental variables and things like that. And so it's all about providing evidence that a process occurred. So you have your data, and process run crate tells you to provide extra information about how that data was created. We have also a profile called 5safes RO crate, which you've already heard us mention. Again, this inherits everything that's in the RO crate base specification and adds some extra requirements around describing processes like validation or compliance or disclosure control. And so this profile is all about providing transparency for the data that's been created and the processes that maybe human processes or automated processes that went into that data creation process. And it's worth noting that these profiles can be compatible with each other. So you could include everything that the process run crate tells you to include in your RO crate metadata, and you could include everything that 5safes crate tells you to include, and that's fine and that's good. You're just providing extra information, and then you can say in your crate that you're conforming not only to the base specification, but one or both of these other profiles. And profiles can also inherit from other profiles, but that's a level of complexity we're not going to get into. So 5safes RO crate. Hopefully you've heard of the 5safes. They are, I've got some notes for this slide, sorry. The 5safes, yeah, that's a structured approach to managing sensitive data through the dimensions of safe people, safe projects, safe settings, safe data, and safe outputs. And it's important for TREs to comply with these 5 safes, or like the legal frameworks that are around this. And so with 5 safes crate, which is this logo, this is the 5 safes crate logo on the right of the screen. 5 safes crate is basically providing a mechanism to capture data, workflows, and provenance with this metadata in a standardized package that can be used to assess that data against the 5 safes. So it's trying to improve that flow of metadata through TRE processes. Put another way, where 5 safes crate aims to enable and record trusted workflow execution in a trusted research environment. In its current state, it represents an entire workflow execution process that's been managed in accordance with the 5 safes framework. So it captures things like the initial request for work to be completed, authentication, approval, review, and then execution. And again, I'll reiterate that sensitive data and its access controls can be represented in the metadata without needing to include the actual data in the crate. Here's a diagram that is from the 5 safes RO crate profile. So you start off with a sort of checking phase where you check the crate for integrity and completeness before passing it into the TRE. The TRE will validate that it's got a crate that meets the profile, and then verify that whoever's requested this workflow has, the relevant permissions to execute it, and that this is sort of, normally this will be a pre-approved workflow. There'll be some sort of sign-off phase on that execution, then the workflow will execute, and then it will go through a disclosure control process before it leaves the TRE and is prepared for publishing, and then it might be received by some client at the end that does additional validation or adds some final metadata to it. So each of these phases is recorded with timestamps and responsible agents. So the people or organizations or tools that are responsible for completing these phases. And some of these phases might fail, but the metadata will still be produced. So if your process is rejected at some of these stages or it fails, it might just return a crate without any data in it, but it will still have the metadata. Now, these phases might not be perfect. One of the big questions that we need to solve early on in TREvolution project is, do these phases align with the reality in trusted research environments? As part of this project, we're going to be probably updating the 5 safes RO crate profile, and a future version, we might need to be a bit more loose about like whether we're always describing a computational workflow, or whether we might be describing other processes as well that maybe aren't workflows. And so we might need to loosen those requirements a little bit. And we also going to think about what tooling is going to be needed to be able to capture these phases and put them all into RO crate metadata. And that's where all the product teams come in. And it might be that we need interactive tooling. It might be that we need hard-coded tooling or automated things. This is all open for discussion. But yeah, the hope is that this will provide a better flow of metadata between the different projects, between the different products and different parts of a TRE. If our services are all using the same format to exchange metadata, then everyone can understand each other. And the idea is that when receiving a crate, you will know how to find, for example, the person that's requested the execution of this process. And you'll know what data they're requesting, and you can go and check that they have permission to access that data if that's what your job is within this structure. And then as you pass the crate along to the next phases, you're adding information to it. And when it reaches the end of the process, it's then something that's publishable. You can put this thing out into the world, you can give it a persistent identifier, and no data needs to be disclosed that isn't able to be disclosed. And it's important to note here that a crate that is compliant to the 5-safes RO crate profile is not inherently safe. This is a structure for the metadata, but it's not the processes themselves. The role of the crate is to streamline that flow of information by standardizing the metadata, and that metadata is then used by the TREs to support the 5-safes processes that they either already have in place or are developing as part of TREvolution. And yeah, it supports also whoever's sending or receiving data to or from TREs. Again, another pause for questions.
So we did have one in the chat that was on does 5-safes RO crate only support workflow-based analysis? So it's touched on in the slides, but if there's any further on that question, then by all means, yeah, feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, the current version of 5-safes RO crate profile expects things to be structured as a workflow. But I think Stian and Warren have already identified that that may not work in a more general case. So 5-safes RO crate was developed as part of a previous project called TREfix, but we're going to be updating it. And so that's one of the things that we'll look at.
Yeah, agreed. So we'll be touching on the goal of what we're doing in TREvolution with this shortly, but as a brief alluding to that, that is one of those things. For example, if there isn't a workflow or there's an implicit one that isn't explicitly a computational workflow, then what do we need to do with the 5-safes crate to make that suitable for a TRE? And does it require updates to the profile? Does it require a completely different profile? These are all questions that we would need to work out with, well, what we'll be talking about next. So I won't do the slides before the slides are here. Let me just check the Google Doc as well, just to make sure there's nothing in there. I'm popping the questions that appear in chat into the doc as well, so we can add the answers as we go along too. If there's any more questions, feel free to either type them in or say them out loud. And if not, we'll continue. Okay, then.
Yeah, I don't see anything else. So I'll hand back over to you, Warren.
Sounds good to me. But yeah, feel free to drop them in as we go, and we'll keep an eye out for them anyway. So back to what we intend to do specifically with TREvolution. So the idea of what things we'll be working on together over the next few months. The core goals, as we briefly mentioned earlier, is to get an idea of, given what our crate is trying to do, how do we get that to be done in practice? So we need to understand and demystify, I guess, in some sense, what needs to be communicated between TREs and what needs to be communicated between services. So, for example, if a TRE is passing something to a service like Sacro or another product, what is it that would need to be communicated minimally between the TRE and other agents to make that process happen? So these are what we'll be doing with requirement gathering meetings. So the idea is to shoot off into one-to-one meetings between ourselves, so myself and, for example, Eli or Alex or other members of the RO Crate team, and work on understanding what it is you're trying to communicate between each other. In the end, what we would hope to have there would be a minimal useful metadata for the domain, and see whether that aligns with an existing profile like 5-safes crate, or whether it needs to be updated to meet those needs. And in the further case, potentially, if any additional profiles are needed. But we would only want to do that with shared consensus, so we wouldn't want to blow up the number of profiles so that every TRE ends up with their own profile, because then again, we're heading back towards not communicating in the same language at all, which begins to, defeat the point of this process. So we need to try and understand across each TRE adopter what is the shared understanding of what's missing from a profile, and try to consolidate that into some agreed upon expansion to that 5-safes crate profile. We also, on a practical level, need to identify what barriers there are to adopting those metadata standards between sites, and see if we can assist with tooling and expertise on those. So understanding what problems you might have in getting the data that's in your TRE and the information that's contained within there into this metadata format would be part of this requirements gathering process. So those requirements gathering meetings, generally what we'll ask about is the data and metadata formats you use. So what format is the data in your TRE currently in? What fields you're actually aiming to capture and communicate. So these could be things like the specification of the data itself. So what attributes appear in that data? What do other sites need to know about that data? But we should emphasize here that we're not aiming to pass the data to other people or make it publicly available. Obviously, we're operating under the idea of FAIR principles with data sensitivity in mind. So the whole point of RO-Crate is not just to release the data into the wild or to other people, but to capture the essential things about that data that needs to be understood for good communication between sites. So to that end as well, we need to know what you use from other products and services. So as mentioned, we have product teams in TREvolution as well. So if you were doing something like disclosure control and output checking with Sacro, what is it that Sacro would need to communicate to a site and vice versa between the two? So if you see all of these, as I mentioned, as nodes in a network, RO-Crate is effectively the language enabling an edge between those two nodes. So it enables and facilitates that communication. We'll then consolidate that information. So if we have individual requirements gathering meetings, we'll consolidate that back to the RO-Crate team and understand whether the existing profile, the 5 states profile, whether that actually aligns with the information we need to capture from TREs, what it does already capture and what it doesn't capture. And then we'll likely come back to another round of a joint meeting to consolidate that information and see if we agree upon what's missing. Profiles, again, if I can move the slide along. So we mentioned those two profiles earlier. We discussed the process run crate, which is more about implicit workflows. So there's the workflow run crate that was discussed with 5 safes, but process run is a more general in case of gathering evidence in the absence of an explicit workflow necessarily. And then you have the 5 safes crates, which is more about transparency and processes, compliance, disclosure, etc. So we're starting with profiles like these that already exist. There's already tooling being developed for them. In the case of the 5 safes crate, some of it's being finished off shortly. So those exist and are usable right now. But in this process, we might either end up with a new version of 5 safes crate, which is the v0.5 plus there, or we might end up with an entirely different profile. So one of the ones that comes to mind is a profile around capturing availability of data within a TRE. So cohort descriptions, access requirements on that data, this sort of data level information on what's actually held within the TRE, there might be a motivation to create a new profile for that, but understanding that motivation and having a good basis for it would be the first step to developing such a profile. Otherwise, it becomes a very non-standard effort between all of ourselves. So that would be 2 potential outcomes of those requirements gathering meetings. As a brief aside as well, this slide landed here, but it's a brief mention of validation of 5 safes crates. So the validator is for RO-Crate in general is the GitHub is linked in the Google Doc, but there is going to be a validator for 5 safes RO-Crates. So if you're implementing an RO-Crate into your product, then you can validate whether or not the information in that crate is whether it's a valid 5 safes crate. So we're using Shackle and Python for that. I think you may have mentioned when that's expected to be finished by earlier. I've forgotten the exact date myself, but we'll come back to that if needed. So that will be assisting with the earlier question of robustness around that metadata and some kind of checking. To summarize the overall of this meeting, again, just to make sure that we're kind of wrapping up into a shared understanding of what we're meant to get from it. So RO-Crate is the underlying technology. It's a way to communicate that information. Profiles, like the 5 safes RO-Crate, those are specializations of the notion of an RO-Crate, specifically for sensitive data. So in the case where you have protocols and access requirements and other things like that, this 5 safes crate's designed to capture that as well. And as mentioned, you can use a combination of these profiles to capture as much as you need, and that's good practice because the more information you have, the better that communication gets. But that should facilitate smoother TRE operations, but we do need input and adoption and testing to figure out whether or not those profiles actually do capture everything we need for smoother TRE operations. So it might be the case that there are some really obvious things missing, or some things that are less obvious that are missing that can be added in down the line. And these sorts of things may fall into the must-have, the should-have, or the may-have, but the overall goal of what we're doing is to identify at the very least what minimally needs to be in a crate or a profile to capture everything that we're trying to do with TREvolution between the adopters and the product teams. So hopefully that gave a bit of an idea of what we're trying to achieve as the RO crate people in TREvolution. Now we